How one hidden radio station misled the entire Luftwaffe hook, the ghost in the machine. In 1943, German bomber crews began reporting something impossible. Their navigation beacons were giving contradictory readings. Radio signals that should guide them to British cities were leading them into empty countryside. Bombs meant for London were falling into fields 40 miles away. The Luftwaffe blamed equipment malfunction. They replaced radios. The problems continued. They blamed atmospheric interference. They recalibrated instruments. The problems got worse. They blamed sabotage. They investigated their own personnel. They found nothing. Because the problem wasn't in Germany, it was broadcasting from a barn in Kent, one radio station, operated by 3 men, broadcasting a signal so perfect, so precisely calibrated, that German bombers couldn't distinguish it from their own navigation beacons. This is the story of Aspidistra, the most powerful radio transmitter ever built, the station that spoke with Germany's own voice, the weapon that turned the Luftwaffe's navigation system against itself, and how 3 British engineers waged psychological warfare using nothing but radio waves and mathematical precision. Historical context. The radio war by 1940, air warfare had evolved beyond visual navigation. Night bombing required precision guidance. German bombers attacked at night to avoid British fighters, but finding targets in the dark required electronic navigation. The Luftwaffe developed a sophisticated system called Knickerbein, crooked leg in English. The system used directional radio beams to guide bombers to targets. 2 beams intersected over the target city. When the bomber detected both beams simultaneously, it released its payload. The system was remarkably effective. German bombers could hit targets within 100 meters on moonless nights. London, Coventry, Liverpool, all were vulnerable. British cities burned while unable to effectively defend themselves. The British discovered Knickerbein in June 1940. A captured German bomber contained navigation equipment tuned to specific frequencies. British scientists analysed the system and understood it immediately. The implications were terrifying. Dr. R.V. Jones, Britain's scientific intelligence officer, reported to Churchill, "The Germans can bomb any target in Britain with precision, regardless of weather or darkness. We are defenceless unless we can disrupt their navigation." Churchill's response was immediate. "Find a way to jam it." The initial jamming efforts were crude but effective. British transmitters broadcast noise on the same frequencies as Knickerbein. The noise disrupted the German navigation signals. Bombers received garbled guidance and missed their targets. But the Germans adapted quickly. They changed frequencies. They increased transmission power. They developed backup systems. By early 1941, the radio war had escalated into a technical arms race. British engineers developed jammers. German engineers developed anti-jamming techniques. British engineers countered with more sophisticated jammers. The cycle continued, but jamming had fundamental limitations. It was defensive. It protected targets but didn't mislead attackers. The Germans knew when they were being jammed. They could abort missions or rely on backup navigation. What Britain needed was something more sophisticated. Not jamming that announced, "You are being deceived," but deception so perfect that Germans never suspected. The concept was called Meaconing, a portmanteau of masking beacon. Instead of blocking German navigation signals, British transmitters would replicate them, but with subtle differences that led bombers astray. The theory was elegant. German bombers would receive what appeared to be legitimate navigation signals. These signals would guide them to locations miles from their intended targets. They would drop bombs on empty fields, believing they were hitting cities. The execution required unprecedented technical precision. The British signal had to match the German signal exactly. Same frequency, same power, same modulation, same timing. Any discrepancy would alert German operators that something was wrong. The deception had to be perfect. Achieving perfection required a transmitter more powerful than anything Britain possessed, more powerful than anything that existed anywhere in the world. The transmitter would need to overpower German signals while appearing identical to them. The engineering challenge was immense. Existing transmitters could broadcast at maybe 50 kilowatts. The proposed system would require 600 kilowatts. That's 12 times more powerful than the strongest commercial broadcaster. The power requirements created secondary problems. The electrical consumption would be enormous. The heat generation would be extraordinary. The antenna system would need to withstand massive electrical forces, and it all had to be built in secret. If the Germans discovered the facility, they would bomb it. If the Germans suspected deception, they would change their navigation system. The entire operation depended on the Germans never knowing they were being misled. In November 1941, the British government approved the project, code name Aspidistra, named after a popular music hall song, The Biggest Aspidistra in the World. The choice of name was darkly humorous. This would indeed be the biggest transmitter in the world. The budget was $150,000, equivalent to $8 million today. The timeline was impossibly aggressive, operational within 8 months. The location was restricted to southern England to maximize signal reach into occupied Europe. The site selected was Crowborough, Sussex, a rural area with existing electrical infrastructure, remote enough to maintain secrecy, close enough to London to support coordination with intelligence services. The facility was disguised as an agricultural research station. The massive antenna was hidden in a barn. The transmitter building was labelled as a storage facility. Local residents were told it was government food production research. Construction began in January 1942. The engineering team consisted of 23 people. Most had no idea what they were actually building. Only 3 men knew the true purpose. Those 3 men would change the course of the air war. Technical analysis. Engineering deception. The Aspidistra transmitter was a marvel of engineering. It consisted of 12 separate amplifier stages. Each stage multiplied the signal power. The final stage output, 600 kilowatts of continuous radio frequency energy. To understand the scale, 600 kilowatts is enough power to run 6,000 homes. All of that power was being converted into radio waves. The electromagnetic field around the transmitter was so intense that metal objects would spark spontaneously. Workers near the antenna reported strange phenomena. Coins in pockets became uncomfortably hot. Metal eyeglass frames caused electrical shocks. The fillings in teeth created odd tingling sensations. These effects were caused by electromagnetic induction from the powerful radio field. Safety protocols were strict. Workers were forbidden from carrying metal objects within 50 feet of the antenna. Medical devices containing metal were prohibited in the facility. Even metal buttons on clothing had to be replaced with wooden alternatives. One incident in July 1942 highlighted the dangers. A maintenance worker forgot to remove his pocket watch before entering the transmitter room. The watch heated rapidly as radio energy induced electrical currents in its metal case. The worker suffered second-degree burns before realizing what was happening. After this incident, metal detectors were installed at the entrance to the transmitter room. Anyone setting off the detector was denied entry until all metal was removed. The protocol was tedious but necessary. The power supply required a dedicated electrical substation. The substation consumed enough electricity to power a small town. The electrical bill alone was $2,000 per month, a staggering sum in 1942. The substation featured 3 250-kilowatt transformers working in parallel. Each transformer weighed 8 tons and required specialized cooling. The transformers were cooled by oil circulation through external radiators. The oil pumps ran continuously, circulating 400 gallons per minute. The electrical infrastructure required constant monitoring. Any voltage fluctuation would affect transmission characteristics. Voltage had to be maintained within 2% of nominal. This required sophisticated voltage regulation equipment that was itself cutting-edge technology. The heat generation was the biggest engineering challenge. 600 kilowatts of radio frequency energy generates approximately 200 kilowatts of waste heat. That's equivalent to 200 electric space heaters running continuously. The transmitter room required an elaborate cooling system. 16 industrial fans circulated 40,000 cubic feet of air per minute. The room temperature was maintained at exactly 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Any variation affected transmission characteristics. The cooling system consumed 40 kilowatts of electricity just to run the fans. In summer, additional refrigeration was required. A dedicated air conditioning system could lower the temperature by 15 degrees. The air conditioning added another 30 kilowatts to power consumption. The cooling system noise was deafening. Sound levels in the transmitter room reached 95 decibels. Workers wore hearing protection at all times. Communication was possible only through hand signals or written notes. The vacuum tubes that generated the radio signal were custom built. Each tube was 4 feet tall and weighed 180 pounds. The tubes cost $400 each, the equivalent of a small car. The transmitter used 48 tubes running simultaneously. These tubes were engineering marvels in themselves. Each tube contained a tungsten filament heated to 2,200 degrees Celsius. The filament emitted electrons that were accelerated to high velocities. These electrons struck a metal target, generating radio frequency energy. The process was only about 60% efficient. 40% of input energy became waste heat within the tube. This heat had to be removed or the tube would melt. Each tube had a dedicated cooling system using forced air. Tube failure was frequent. The intense power levels shortened tube life dramatically. Each tube lasted approximately 2,000 hours before burnout. At 12 hours per day operation, that's only 5 to 6 months of service. Replacing a failed tube required shutting down the transmitter for 4 hours. The tube had to cool completely before it could be safely handled. Even after cooling, the tubes remained too hot to touch for 90 minutes. Specialized lifting equipment was required due to the 180-pound weight. The maintenance schedule was brutal. Every 48 hours, all tubes were inspected. Visual inspection looked for discoloration, cracks, or other damage. Electrical tests measured filament resistance and emission characteristics. Every week, suspect tubes were replaced preemptively. If a tube showed any sign of degradation, it was swapped out immediately. This prevented unexpected failures during critical operations. The cost was substantial, approximately $800 per week in replacement tubes. Every month, the entire system was recalibrated. This required 24 hours of continuous testing and adjustment. Every component was measured and verified against specifications. Any deviation was corrected through adjustment or replacement. The antenna system was equally impressive. A traditional antenna for these frequencies would be 200 feet tall, but a 200-foot tower would be visible for miles and vulnerable to bombing. The engineers designed a horizontal antenna concealed inside a barn. The antenna was 180 feet long and mounted just below the barn roof. The barn itself became part of the antenna system. The wooden structure was transparent to radio waves but provided visual concealment. The antenna consisted of copper tubing 4 inches in diameter. The tubing was suspended by ceramic insulators to prevent energy loss. The insulators had to withstand 50,000 volts of radio frequency potential. Standard insulators would arc and shatter under these conditions. Custom insulators were manufactured from special high-voltage ceramic. Each insulator cost $30, expensive for what looked like a simple porcelain disc. The antenna required 120 insulators. Total insulator cost $3,600. The antenna system required precision tuning. The electrical characteristics had to match German transmitters exactly. This meant matching not just frequency but impedance, radiation pattern, and polarization. Impedance matching was critical. If the antenna impedance didn't match the transmitter output impedance, energy would be reflected back into the transmitter. Reflected energy would damage the output tubes. The impedance had to match within 5%. Achieving this match required adjustable matching networks. The networks consisted of variable capacitors and inductors. These components could be adjusted to compensate for antenna variations. The adjustments were made while transmitting at low power, then verified at full power. Getting these parameters correct required weeks of testing. Engineers would transmit test signals and measure the results from receiving stations 50 miles away. They adjusted antenna geometry until the signal characteristics matched German transmitters. The test receivers were located at Dover, 35 miles from Crowborough; Beachy Head, 22 miles from Crowborough; Dungeness, 40 miles from Crowborough. Each location provided different measurement angles. By analyzing signals from all 3 locations, engineers could characterize the complete radiation pattern. The pattern had to match German transmitters, as measured from occupied Europe. But the most sophisticated part wasn't the hardware. It was the control system. Aspidistra needed to transmit signals that were nearly identical to German navigation beacons, but with subtle modifications that led bombers astray. The modifications had to be imperceptible to German operators, but effective in causing navigation errors. The solution was brilliant. Aspidistra transmitted the same signal as German beacons, but with a slight timing delay. The delay was less than 1 millisecond. German equipment couldn't detect such a small delay, but the delay accumulated over distance. A bomber navigating using the delayed signal would gradually drift off course. The drift was only about 1 mile per 10 miles travelled, but over a 200-mile flight, the accumulated error was 20 miles. 20 miles meant the difference between hitting London and hitting empty fields. The timing control required atomic clock precision. In 1942, atomic clocks didn't exist. The engineers used a crystal oscillator stabilized to 1 part in 10 million. This was the most accurate timing device in Britain. The oscillator used a quartz crystal vibrating at exactly 1,000,000 Hertz. The crystal was cut to precise dimensions and mounted in a temperature-controlled oven. The oven maintained the crystal at exactly 68,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperature control was accurate to 0.01 degrees. Any temperature variation would change the crystal's vibration frequency. A 0.1 degree temperature change would cause 1 part per million frequency error. Over a 3-hour bomber mission, this would create unacceptable navigation errors. The oscillator was kept in a temperature-controlled vault. Temperature variations of even 1 degree would affect timing. The vault was maintained at exactly 68.0 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity at 45%. The vault was buried 10 feet underground. This provided thermal stability. Underground temperatures vary much less than surface temperatures. The vault walls were insulated with 18 inches of fiberglass. A thermostat-controlled heater maintained exact temperature. The entire system was monitored by a single engineer during operations. His name was Peter Eckersley. He was 52 years old, a former BBC engineer, and arguably the best radio engineer in Britain. Eckersley had started his career in radio in 1910. He had designed some of the BBC's first transmitters. He understood radio engineering at an intuitive level that no textbook could teach. His colleagues described him as being able to hear radio signals. He could listen to a transmission and identify subtle distortions that instruments couldn't detect. He could predict equipment failures before they occurred based on barely perceptible signal changes. Eckersley's job was to listen to German navigation signals and match them perfectly with Aspidistra. He would tune Aspidistra to transmit on the exact same frequency as the German beacon. Then he would adjust the timing delay to create the desired navigation error. The process required extraordinary skill. German beacons changed frequencies periodically to avoid jamming. Eckersley had to detect the frequency changes immediately and retune Aspidistra within 30 seconds. If the retune took longer, German bombers would notice the signal disappearing. Eckersley developed an intuitive understanding of the German navigation network. He maintained detailed logs of every German beacon. He recorded frequency, power level, modulation characteristics, operating schedule. Over months, he learned to predict German operating patterns. He could predict frequency changes before they happened. German beacons followed subtle patterns in their frequency selection. Eckersley noticed that frequency changes often occurred at 15-minute intervals. He would prepare Aspidistra to retune preemptively. He could identify which German transmitter was active based on signal characteristics. Each German transmitter had subtle, unique characteristics, like a fingerprint: slight frequency instability, modulation depth variations, timing irregularities. These characteristics were imperceptible to most operators, but obvious to Eckersley. He could calculate the required timing delay to achieve specific navigation errors. He understood the geometry of bomber navigation. He knew how timing delays would affect aircraft at different distances and altitudes. He could set the delay to place bomb impacts precisely where he wanted them. His colleagues described him as part technician, part artist, part wizard. He worked 12-hour shifts, 3 days per week. During those shifts, he would successfully mislead dozens of German bombers. His workspace was Spartan: a chair, a workbench with radio receivers and controls, a logbook for recording operations, nothing else. He worked in silence except for the radio signals. He wore high-quality headphones to hear subtle signal characteristics. He made notes in his logbook using a special pencil. Regular pens contained metal nibs that interfered with radio equipment. The concentration required was exhausting. Missing a German frequency change meant bombers would lose navigation and potentially discover the deception. Any error could expose Aspidistra's existence. The pressure was immense, but Eckersley never failed. In 3 years of operation, Aspidistra never exposed itself through operator error. Every German frequency change was matched. Every timing delay was calculated correctly. Every deception was executed perfectly. The first operational test occurred on March 3, 1942. German bombers were targeting Portsmouth. Eckersley tuned Aspidistra to match the German navigation beacon. He introduced a timing delay calculated to shift bomb impact 15 miles west. The test was successful. German bombs fell on uninhabited moorland. Portsmouth remained untouched. German after-action reports noted no evidence of anything unusual. Eckersley recorded in his log, "First operational use successful. German bombers deceived without detection. Timing delay of 0.85 milliseconds achieved desired 15-mile displacement. no indication that German operators noticed anything unusual. System performs as designed. The second test was more ambitious. On March 14, 1942, German bombers targeted Coventry. Eckersley calculated a timing delay that would shift impact 25 miles northeast. This would place the bomb impacts in rural Leicestershire. The test succeeded beyond expectations. Not a single bomb hit Coventry. German bombs destroyed approximately 40 acres of farmland. 3 sheep were killed. No humans were injured. German intelligence analysed the raid. Their conclusion: target successfully engaged. Estimated 70% of ordnance delivered on target. They had no idea they had bombed farmland instead of a city. Eckersley wrote in his log, "Second operational test demonstrates that navigation displacement can be sustained over longer distances. 25-mile displacement achieved with 1.2 millisecond delay. German bombers showed no indication of suspicion. System reliability confirmed. The deception was perfect." Operational expansion, beyond navigation. The success of navigation deception encouraged broader applications. If Aspidistra could mislead bomber navigation, what else could it do? The answer was almost anything that involved radio. The Luftwaffe used radio for more than navigation. They broadcast orders to aircraft in flight. They transmitted weather reports. They sent recall signals when missions were aborted. They provided damage assessment information. All of these communications could be spoofed. The first experiment with false orders occurred in April 1942. German bombers were returning from a raid on Liverpool. Aspidistra broadcast a false recall message using German protocols and codes. The message was transmitted in authentic German military code. British intelligence had broken many German codes through ultra-decryption. They knew the proper format, authentication codes, and transmission protocols. The message was indistinguishable from legitimate German communications. The message ordered bombers to return to base immediately due to approaching weather. The message cited storm systems that actually existed, gathered from meteorological intelligence. The weather threat was real, but not severe enough to warrant recall. German bombers had no way to verify the threat without returning. 14 bombers received the message and aborted their return journey. They landed at emergency airfields in occupied France instead of their home bases. The emergency airfields lacked proper maintenance facilities and ammunition supplies. Several aircraft crashed attempting emergency landings in darkness. 2 bombers crashed with total loss of crew. 4 aircraft were damaged beyond immediate repair. The remaining bombers were out of service for 24 to 48 hours while being relocated. German intelligence investigated the recall order. They interviewed the command officers who supposedly issued it. The officers denied issuing any recall. This created confusion and doubt within the chain of command. Eventually, German intelligence concluded the recall was genuine, but issued in error by a junior officer. They never suspected British deception. The incident was classified as procedural error and filed. But the success of this operation opened new possibilities. If one false order could disrupt 14 bombers, what could systematic false orders achieve? Aspidistra began regular false order broadcasts. The orders were carefully crafted to seem plausible while causing maximum disruption. The key was mimicking authentic German communication patterns exactly. German military radio followed strict protocols. Messages used specific call signs for different units. Messages included authentication codes that changed daily. Messages followed standardized formats with predictable phrasing. British intelligence provided Aspidistra operators with all this information. Ultra-decryption revealed call signs, authentication codes, and message formats. Aspidistra operators could craft messages indistinguishable from legitimate German communications. False weather reports warned of storms that didn't exist. The reports cited specific meteorological conditions: wind speeds, cloud ceiling, visibility. The conditions were plausible based on actual weather patterns. German pilots had no way to verify the reports until they encountered the supposed weather. By then, missions had been aborted or diverted. When pilots discovered the weather wasn't as reported, they assumed forecasting errors. They never suspected enemy deception. False navigation updates provided incorrect wind speeds. Wind affects bomber navigation significantly. A 20 mm error in estimated wind speed creates a 5-mile navigation error over a 100-mile flight. Aspidistra's false wind reports amplified navigation errors already caused by timing delays. German bombers using both corrupted navigation beacons and false wind reports were hopelessly lost. They would bomb targets 30 to 40 miles from their intended location. They would report mission success while having achieved nothing. False recall signals aborted missions at critical moments. Aspidistra monitored German bomber radio traffic to identify mission timing. When bombers were 30 minutes from target, Aspidistra would broadcast a false recall. The timing was carefully chosen to maximize disruption. If the recall came too early, bombers could restart the mission. If it came too late, bombers would ignore it. But 30 minutes from target was the critical window. Bombers had committed resources but hadn't achieved objectives. Aborting at this point wasted fuel, ordnance load, crew time, and mission preparation. The resources couldn't be easily recovered. The mission had to be rescheduled from scratch. False damage assessments claimed successful hits on targets that were untouched. These assessments were transmitted after missions as part of intelligence reports. German commanders relied on these assessments to evaluate whether targets required follow-up attacks. Aspidistra would broadcast false assessments praising mission success. Target successfully engaged. Estimated 60% destruction of industrial facilities. Secondary explosions observed. Major fires reported. Target assessed as non-functional. German commanders would receive this assessment and conclude the target was neutralized. They would allocate bombing resources to other targets. The actual target would remain operational and undamaged. This tactic saved countless British lives and industrial capacity. Factories that should have been destroyed remained operational. Cities that should have been rubble remained inhabited. The Luftwaffe bombed phantom targets while real targets escaped unscathed. The cumulative effect was devastating to German strategic planning. German intelligence relied on damage assessments to track bombing campaign effectiveness. If assessments were systematically false, intelligence conclusions would be systematically wrong. German commanders believed they were destroying British industrial capacity. They weren't. They were wasting resources on already destroyed targets or missing targets entirely. The false information created a feedback loop of failure. Bad intelligence led to bad decisions. Bad decisions led to wasted resources. Wasted resources reduced German military capability. Reduced capability led to more desperation and worse decisions. But the most devastating use of Aspidistra wasn't against bombers. It was against German propaganda. In mid-1942, Aspidistra began broadcasting fake German news programs. The broadcasts mimicked official German radio stations perfectly. Same frequency, same format, same announcers, same music, but with subtle differences in content. The operation required obtaining recordings of actual German broadcasters. British intelligence recorded German radio continuously. They analysed the recordings to understand broadcaster vocal characteristics. Then they found British voice actors who could mimic those characteristics. The voice actors were German-speaking British citizens, often German refugees. They studied German broadcaster mannerisms obsessively, pacing, pronunciation, tonal patterns, emotional inflections. Every detail mattered. The mimicry had to be perfect. The fake broadcasts followed the same structure as real German broadcasts. Opening music, news headlines, detailed reports, commentary, cultural programming, closing announcements. The content was sophisticated. Pure fabrication would be detected immediately. Aspidistra mixed truth with lies in a ratio calculated to maintain credibility. 80% of each broadcast was verifiable fact. This established the broadcast as legitimate. 20% was carefully crafted disinformation. This achieved the psychological objective. For example, a broadcast might report, "German forces today achieved tactical victory at true location. Enemy casualties estimated at accurate number. Our forces sustained actual casualties, slightly inflated. Production at the Krupp works reached realistic number. However, supply difficulties continue to affect operations in true location where supply problems existed. Civilian morale in city remains challenged by ongoing shortages, true but emphasized. The first 80% was true and verifiable. The last 20% planted doubt and demoralization. Listeners accepted the entire message because most of it was accurate. The psychological impact was subtle but cumulative. Germans listening to these broadcasts weren't hearing obvious propaganda. They were hearing what sounded like honest German reporting, but the reporting emphasized problems, shortages, and difficulties. Over weeks and months, this created a pervasive sense of things going wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, that would be dismissed as obvious propaganda, but gradually, incrementally wrong. The kind of wrong that feels inevitable and irreversible. The broadcasts reported coal shortages affecting industrial production, true but exaggerated. Transportation delays disrupting supply lines, true but emphasized. Civilian morale problems in bombed cities, true but highlighted. Minor military setbacks presented as more significant, partially true but reframed. Each individual claim was plausible or verifiable. But the cumulative message was, Germany is losing slowly but certainly. German security services detected these broadcasts in August 1942. They issued warnings that enemy broadcasts were impersonating German stations. But the warnings themselves created the problem they were trying to solve. If you tell people that enemy broadcasts sound identical to friendly broadcasts, you create paranoia. Every German broadcast becomes suspect. Did I just hear a German station or an enemy station? The uncertainty was as damaging as the actual deception. German citizens began doubting all radio broadcasts. If some broadcasts were fake, how could you trust any broadcast? The erosion of trust in official media was catastrophic for Nazi propaganda efforts. Nazi propaganda relied on citizens believing official statements. If citizens doubted everything, propaganda became impossible. The Nazis had created a system where only official media was legal, but Aspidistra made official media unreliable. The Nazis couldn't shut down radio without eliminating their primary propaganda tool. They couldn't leave radio operational without enabling British deception. They were trapped in an impossible situation. Goebbels wrote in his diary in September 1942, "The British have developed a capability to broadcast on our frequencies with sufficient power to reach German citizens. We cannot effectively jam these broadcasts without disrupting our own transmissions. We cannot convince citizens to ignore these broadcasts because they sound identical to our broadcasts. This is becoming a serious problem with no apparent solution." The problem was unsolvable with 1940s technology. Aspedistra's power was so enormous that German jamming was ineffective. The only solution would be to shut down German broadcasting entirely. But German propaganda depended on radio. The Nazis chose to continue broadcasting and hoped that Germans would trust official sources over suspicious broadcasts. But trust was exactly what Aspedistra was designed to erode. Every false broadcast planted doubt. Every doubt reduced trust in official statements. Reduced trust undermined propaganda effectiveness. Undermined propaganda weakened civilian morale. Weakened morale reduced industrial productivity and military support. The cascade of effects was impossible to quantify, but clearly significant. German productivity declined throughout 1943-1944. Military morale deteriorated steadily. Civilian support for the war effort weakened progressively. How much of this was caused by Aspedistra versus other factors? Impossible to determine. But post-war interviews with German civilians consistently mentioned confusion about radio broadcasts. Many reported hearing conflicting information and not knowing what to believe. The confusion was the objective. Aspedistra didn't need to convince Germans of specific facts. It only needed to make Germans doubt official propaganda. Once doubt was established, the Nazi propaganda system collapsed under its own weight. Human impact. The bomber crews who never knew. The men who flew German bombers had no idea they were being systematically deceived. They trusted their navigation equipment absolutely. The equipment had worked flawlessly for years. Why would they suspect anything had changed? Hauptmann Friedrich Müller commanded a Heinkel He 111 squadron based in occupied France. His squadron conducted night bombing raids against British industrial targets. On April 23, 1942, his squadron was ordered to bomb the Rolls-Royce aircraft engine factory in Derby. The mission briefing was standard. Navigate using the Knickerbein beacon. Release bombs when both guidance beams intersected. Return to base. Müller's bomber followed the navigation guidance perfectly. The instruments showed they were approaching Derby. Both guidance beams converged. Müller ordered bombs released. The bombs fell. The crew saw explosions below. The mission seemed successful. But the bombs had actually fallen on uninhabited moorland 30 miles from Derby. Aspedistra had shifted the navigation beacon. Müller's instruments showed correct navigation, but the instruments were being fed false information. Müller returned to base and reported mission success. His report stated, "Target engaged successfully, large fires observed, no enemy fighter opposition encountered." German intelligence analyzed the report and classified the mission as successful. The Rolls-Royce factory continued producing engines without interruption. Müller flew 47 more combat missions before being shot down in 1943. He was captured and spent the remainder of the war in a POW camp. In post-war interrogation, he was asked about mission success rates. He reported, "Approximately 75% of our missions achieved successful target engagement based on visual confirmation and damage assessment reports." The interrogator asked, "How do you know the targets you hit were the intended targets?" Müller paused, confused by the question. "The navigation equipment guided us to the target. The beams intersected over the target. We released ordnance. The target was hit." The interrogator explained, "Many of your navigation beacons were spoofed by British transmitters. You may have been bombing fields while believing you were bombing cities." Müller was silent for several minutes. Then he said, "That's impossible. The navigation system was too sophisticated to spoof. We would have detected any deception." The interrogator showed him technical documents describing Aspedistra. Müller read them carefully. His face went pale. "My God, we never knew. We trusted the equipment completely. If what you're showing me is accurate, then most of our missions after 1942 may have hit nothing of value." He paused again. "All those missions, all those risks, all those friends who died, for nothing." Müller's experience was typical. Post-war interrogations of hundreds of Luftwaffe bomber crew revealed a consistent pattern. None suspected that their navigation was being manipulated. None had any idea that Aspidistra existed. Even after being informed, many refused to believe it. The deception was so complete that accepting the truth required abandoning their understanding of their own wartime experience. Oberleutnant Hans Dietrich was a navigator in a Junkers Jew 88 squadron. His job was monitoring navigation instruments and confirming target approach. He took pride in his precision. In post-war interrogation, he described his methodology. "I cross-referenced multiple navigation systems, radio beacons, dead reckoning, celestial navigation when possible. If all systems agreed, I had confidence in our position." The interrogator asked, "What if all systems were being fed false information?" Dietrich replied, "Impossible. Dead reckoning is independent of radio. Celestial navigation uses stars. These cannot be spoofed." The interrogator explained, "But if your radio navigation showed you were 20 miles from your actual position, and you used that as your starting point for dead reckoning, all subsequent calculations would be wrong." Dietrich realized the implication immediately. "We used radio navigation as our primary system. Dead reckoning was calculated from the last known radio position. If the radio position was false—" He trailed off. The foundation of his entire navigational framework had been corrupted. "How many missions?" he asked. "How many of my missions were actually successful versus hitting empty fields?" The interrogator had no answer. The exact success rate was unknowable, but the evidence suggested that after mid-1942, the majority of German night bombing missions achieved little strategic impact. The psychological impact on these men was profound. They had risked their lives repeatedly. They had watched friends die. They had believed they were fighting effectively. Learning that much of their effort had been rendered meaningless by a hidden transmitter was crushing. Several former Luftwaffe personnel suffered psychological breakdowns upon learning the truth. But not all bomber crews were misled by Aspidistra. Daytime bombing missions used visual navigation. Missions in good weather relied on landmarks. Aspidistra was only effective against night missions using radio navigation. This created a strategic shift in German bombing patterns. After 1942, the Luftwaffe increasingly favoured daytime raids. But daytime raids faced British fighter opposition. Bomber losses increased dramatically. The shift was partially driven by deteriorating night bombing effectiveness. German planners noticed that night raids were achieving poor results. They attributed this to improved British defences. They never suspected that their navigation was being systematically corrupted. The operational response, shifting to daytime bombing, played directly into British strengths. RAF fighters were extremely effective in daylight. German bomber losses mounted. The Luftwaffe's strategic bombing capability was steadily eroded. Aspidistra didn't win the air war alone, but it contributed to a strategic shift that ultimately favoured Britain. Modern relevance, electronic warfare principles. Aspidistra pioneered techniques that remain central to modern electronic warfare. The core principle: use the enemy's own systems against them. Don't destroy enemy communications. Corrupt them. Modern military doctrine calls this electronic attack. The goal isn't to block enemy signals, but to degrade the enemy's trust in their own systems. Aspidistra achieved this 80 years ago with 1940s technology. The principle of spoofing is now universal. GPS navigation can be spoofed by broadcasting false signals. Communication networks can be penetrated and used to send false orders. Radar systems can be fed false target information. The technical challenge is identical to what Aspidistra faced: perfect replication. The false signal must be indistinguishable from the real signal. Any discrepancy alerts the enemy that deception is occurring. Modern GPS spoofing follows the Aspidistra playbook exactly. A transmitter broadcasts GPS-like signals slightly more powerful than actual GPS satellites. The false signals gradually introduce position errors. The victim's GPS receiver shows accurate-looking data that's actually false. The technique has been used operationally. In 2011, Iran captured a US RQ-170 drone allegedly using GPS spoofing. The drone believed it was landing at its home base. It was actually landing at an Iranian airfield. The parallel to Aspidistra is exact. German bombers believed they were over their targets. They were actually over empty countryside. The deception worked because the navigation data appeared legitimate. The defense against spoofing is cryptographic authentication. Modern military GPS uses encrypted signals that cannot be replicated without keys. Commercial GPS remains vulnerable because it's unencrypted, but encryption creates its own problems. It requires distributing cryptographic keys securely. It requires updating keys when they're compromised. It requires computational power to decrypt signals. The fundamental tension remains. Secure systems are complex and expensive. Simple systems are vulnerable to spoofing. There is no perfect solution. The Aspidistra principle extends beyond navigation. Any system that relies on external signals for critical information is vulnerable. Communication systems, radar systems, weapon guidance systems, all can potentially be spoofed. Modern electronic warfare is a chess game of deception and counter-deception. One side develops spoofing techniques. The other side develops detection methods. The first side develops anti-detection techniques. The cycle continues infinitely. Aspidistra won its chess game because the Germans didn't know they were playing. Modern adversaries are far more aware of electronic warfare. But awareness doesn't guarantee defense. Sophisticated deception can still succeed even against prepared opponents. The strategic lesson is profound. The best weapon is the one the enemy doesn't know exists. German bombers were being defeated but didn't know it. They continued flying missions with gradually decreasing effectiveness. By the time they understood what was happening, the war was already lost. This principle applies beyond military operations. In information warfare, the most effective operations are those that never become public. If the target realizes they're being deceived, they adapt their defenses. If the target never realizes, the deception can continue indefinitely. How many modern electronic warfare operations remain unknown? How many GPS systems are being spoofed without users realizing? How many communication networks are compromised without anyone noticing? The answer is unknowable by definition. Successful deception operations remain secret. We only know about the operations that failed or were eventually revealed. Aspidistra operated for 3 years before the Germans understood what was happening. By then, the war was nearly over. The revelation came too late to matter. How many modern Aspidistras are operating right now? Unknown. That's the point. Strategic impact. The war that wasn't fought. Measuring Aspidistra's strategic impact is challenging. The station didn't destroy enemy forces. It didn't capture territory. It didn't win dramatic battles. What it did was prevent battles from being fought. Cities that weren't bombed didn't need to be rebuilt. Factories that remained operational continued producing weapons. Civilians who weren't killed continued supporting the war effort. The negative space of war is harder to measure than victories, but it matters just as much. British industrial production increased throughout 1942-1944. This wasn't because factories were invulnerable. It was because German bombers were hitting empty fields instead of factories. Aircraft production in Britain grew from 15,000 per year in 1941 to 26,000 per year in 1944. Tank production increased from 4,800 per year to 7,500 per year. The industrial base that supported Allied victory was protected partially by Aspidistra. The Luftwaffe flew thousands of missions that achieved nothing. Fuel was consumed. Air crews were exhausted. Aircraft wore out from operational stress. Bombs were dropped on targets of no military value. These resources could have been used elsewhere. The Eastern Front desperately needed air support. The Battle of the Atlantic required long-range patrol aircraft. North Africa needed tactical bombing capability. Instead, Luftwaffe resources were wasted bombing British countryside. The waste accumulated over months and years. Eventually, the cumulative waste mattered more than any single battle. German military effectiveness is often attributed to superior tactics and equipment, but effectiveness requires accurate information. If your information is corrupted, your tactics become irrelevant. German bombers flew perfect tactical missions using perfect navigation techniques, but they were navigating to the wrong locations. Perfection in execution cannot compensate for corruption in information. This principle applies beyond military strategy. Organizations can execute flawlessly while pursuing the wrong objectives. Individuals can work extremely hard while heading in the wrong direction. Perfect execution of flawed strategy guarantees failure. Aspidistra created flawed strategy by corrupting the information German planners used. German commanders believed their bombing campaign was effective. They allocated resources to continue the campaign. The resources were wasted. By the time they realized the campaign was failing, they lacked resources to course correct. The opportunity cost was irrecoverable. The psychological impact on German military leadership is harder to measure, but equally important. Goebbels' diary entries from 1943-1944 reveal increasing frustration. In March 1943, our bombing campaign against Britain achieves diminishing returns. Crews report successful missions, but strategic impact is minimal. In August 1943, intelligence suggests British industrial production is increasing despite our bombing. Either our damage assessments are wrong, or something else is happening that we don't understand. In February 1944, we must accept that our strategic bombing campaign has failed. Resources must be reallocated, but to where? The admission of failure was itself a strategic victory for Britain. German resources were redirected from ineffective bombing to other operations. But the redirection came late. Years of resources had been wasted. The counterfactual question is impossible but important. What if Aspidistra hadn't existed? Would German bombing have been significantly more effective? Would British industrial production have been reduced? Would the war have lasted longer? Conservative estimates suggest Aspidistra reduced German bombing effectiveness by 30 to 40%. More aggressive estimates suggest 50–60%. Even the conservative estimate is strategically significant. If German bombing had been 40% more effective, British aircraft production might have been reduced by 15%. That's approximately 4,000 fewer aircraft per year. Over 3 years, that's 12,000 aircraft. 12,000 aircraft represents substantial military capability. Fighter squadrons, bomber forces, transport capacity, all would have been reduced. The D-Day invasion required absolute air superiority. Would that superiority have been achievable with 12,000 fewer aircraft? Unknowable. But Aspidistra made the question irrelevant by ensuring those 12,000 aircraft were built. Conclusion. The silent victory. Aspidistra broadcast its final deception operation on May 7, 1945. Germany surrendered the next day. The transmitter was powered down. The mission was complete. Over 3 years of operation, Aspidistra had misled thousands of German bomber missions, broadcast hundreds of hours of false propaganda, consumed enough electricity to power a city, cost over $300,000 to build and operate. The return on investment was incalculable. How many British lives were saved? How much industrial capacity was preserved? How much German war effort was wasted? The numbers are unknowable, but the strategic impact was profound. After the war, Aspidistra remained classified for 15 years. The British government didn't want potential adversaries to know such capabilities existed. The technical details remained secret until 1960. Even then, many operational details remained classified until the 1980s. Peter Eckersley, the engineer who operated Aspidistra, returned to the BBC after the war. He resumed his pre-war position as chief engineer. He never publicly discussed his wartime work during his lifetime. His colleagues at the BBC knew he had done something important during the war. But they had no idea what. Eckersley was offered numerous honours after the war. He declined most of them. He accepted an OBE in 1946, but only because refusing would have drawn attention. The citation simply stated, "For services to wartime communications." He lived quietly in London until his death in 1963. His obituary in the Times mentioned he had contributed to wartime technical operations. No details were provided. The obituary devoted more space to his pre-war BBC engineering work. The full extent of his contribution wasn't revealed until 1985. A BBC documentary about wartime intelligence operations finally told Aspidistra's story. By then, Eckersley had been dead for 22 years. He never received public recognition for his extraordinary achievement. His daughter was interviewed for the documentary. She learned for the first time what her father had actually done during the war. She described feeling shocked and proud simultaneously. Father never spoke about the war. We knew he had worked on something classified, but we had no idea of the scale or importance. To learn that he personally misled thousands of German bombers, it's almost impossible to comprehend. She was asked if she thought her father would have wanted the recognition. She replied, "No. He believed that the best operations were the ones nobody knew about. He would probably have preferred that Aspidistra remain secret forever. But I'm glad people know now. His contribution deserves to be remembered." The other 2 engineers who built Aspidistra similarly faded into obscurity. One returned to teaching. One joined a commercial electronics company. Neither ever sought recognition for their work. Both declined interviews when Aspidistra was finally declassified. They maintained that the work was classified for good reasons. Discussing it publicly felt like betraying the trust placed in them. The facility at Crowborough was dismantled in 1945. The transmitter was broken down for parts. The valuable vacuum tubes were salvaged for other projects. The antenna barn was torn down. The site was returned to agricultural use. Today, nothing marks the location. A small industrial park sits where Aspidistra once broadcast. A few buildings, some parking lots, ordinary commercial businesses. Few local residents know what happened there. The history has been forgotten. One local historian placed a small plaque on a fence post in 1990. The plaque reads, "Near this site stood Aspidistra, the radio transmitter that misled German bombers, 1942-1945. The plaque is weathered and barely legible. Most people walk past it without noticing. But the principles Aspidistra pioneered remain relevant. Every modern military possesses electronic warfare capabilities. GPS spoofing, communication intercepts, false signal injection, all are standard tactics. The technology has evolved, but the strategy remains identical. Use the enemy's systems against them. Make them trust false information. Let them execute perfect tactics, pursuing wrong objectives. The lesson of Aspidistra is uncomfortable. Perfect execution cannot overcome corrupted information. German bomber crews were skilled, brave, and dedicated. They flew their missions flawlessly. They navigated with precision. They dropped their bombs exactly where their instruments indicated. And they achieved nothing, because their instruments lied to them. In an age of information warfare, this lesson is more relevant than ever. We rely on electronic systems for navigation, communication, coordination. What if those systems are feeding us false information? How would we know? The answer is, we might not know. Just as German bomber crews didn't know. Just as the Luftwaffe didn't know until it was too late. The most effective deception is the one that's never detected. Aspidistra operated for 3 years before the Germans fully understood what was happening. By then, the damage was irreversible. How many modern Aspidistras are operating today? How many electronic warfare operations are actively deceiving militaries around the world? How many navigation systems, communication networks, and information sources are compromised? We don't know. That's the point. Successful deception remains invisible until it's revealed. The engineers who built Aspidistra understood this. They created a weapon that worked by being undetectable. The weapon's effectiveness depended on secrecy. Recognition would have meant failure. So they worked in silence. They achieved victory in silence. They returned to civilian life in silence. Their names are barely remembered. Their achievement is largely forgotten. But their impact was profound. Aspidistra was a weapon made of invisible forces, radio waves that bent reality, signals that corrupted truth, deception that masqueraded as accuracy. 3 men in a barn in Kent, misleading the entire Luftwaffe, changing the course of the air war, with nothing but mathematics and electromagnetic radiation, the ghost in the machine, the voice that spoke with the enemy's accent, the signal that guided bombers to nowhere, Aspidistra, the biggest transmitter in the world, the most successful deception in electronic warfare history, the weapon that won by making the enemy defeat themselves, silent, invisible, decisive, and largely forgotten, until now, until now, until now, until now, until now, until now, until now.